Welcome to Data in Biotech, a podcast from Cordine where we explore how companies leverage data to drive innovation in life sciences. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with an expert from the world of biotechnology to understand how they're using data science to solve technical challenges, streamline operations, and further innovation in their business. Today, we're joined by Patrick Leung, Chief Technology Officer at Faro Health. Patrick shares his journey from finance and big tech to life sciences and explains how AI is transforming clinical trial design and reducing inefficiencies. He and Ross discuss the inefficiencies in traditional clinical trials and how Faro Health leverages AI to optimize protocol design, reduce patient burden, and streamline operations. Patrick also shares his insights with Ross into the challenges of AI adoption in biotech, the evolving role of regulatory agencies, and the future of AI-driven drug development. Here we go.
Patrick Leung, welcome to the Data and Biotech podcast.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, just to kick us off, can you just give us an introduction to your background and what brought you here today?
Sure. I'm currently the Chief Technology Officer of Faro Health, and we are an AI-based SaaS platform for clinical trial development. And I have a long background in data science and AI, having worked at Google and Two Sigma Investments and various other companies in the past.
Awesome. How did your career lead you to Faro Health, considering you've been in finance previously and other things like that?
Yeah, I think I realized at some point that I really want to work in companies that have a real mission. And so previously I started my own company doing ecological restoration. And when it was time for a change, I really wanted to find a company that helped to, make the human condition better. And it's really interesting. Life sciences is so fascinating to me. It's a very unique industry. Being relatively new to the field, it really took me a while to realize, wow, it takes up to a dozen years and maybe a couple of $1 billion to get a drug to market. That just seems like a lot. And there's real human lives kind of in many cases at stake here, or at least the alleviation of suffering in the sense that there's so many new, incredible medications and molecules coming up, and it takes them a long time to get into patients' hands. And so I felt that was a really worthy mission that Faro was endeavoring to pursue. And so I came in last year and have brought a lot of my knowledge and experience into this organization.
How do you feel like your background has brought sort of a unique lens to the kind of work that Faro Health is doing? Or, where are the areas where you feel like your background sort of like positions you well to accomplish certain goals at the company?
Yeah, I think that spending over 10 years at Google helped me a lot to realize what a really high-performing software engineering company operates like. And I think that not having a long background in life sciences and not being kind of, indoctrinated into a lot of the ways of doing things helped to bring a fresh perspective to this. It really sort of shocked me that something as complex and as high stakes as a clinical trial was essentially being mastered in Microsoft Word in many cases, or some kind of document authoring system. And to me, this is a complex project plan that really deserves to have its own dedicated, highly structured and advanced system. And so this is really what Faro set out to do. And I think that my bringing in just the application of AI and data science and other areas like private investing and like conversational AI just helped to bring a bit of a fresh perspective on how to solve these problems going back to first principles. And I think that's really borne out in the last year to 18 months, during which we've been really bringing AI into this company, into this field.
Yeah, awesome. I want to explore some of the AI aspects of it a little later on in the conversation. But before I do, you mentioned that a lot of clinical trial designs are sort of, drafted in Microsoft Word, and that's the document type from which the clinical trial designs are run. Can you give us your perspective on how not having a more structured approach leads to inefficiencies in the way that clinical trials are designed or conducted?
Yeah, I mean, we've been really delving into the protocol document and how best to generate that using AI. We can get into that later. But essentially, what I realized was that these documents contain a ton of quantitative information that's been summarized in various places. And this information gets repeated in many other documents further down the line, the ICF and other critical documents during the course of the lifetime of the clinical trial. And so in many ways, storing such information in an unstructured format like a Microsoft Word document is probably the worst thing you could be doing as far as avoiding kind of errors arising from duplication of information. And if you have to go back and sort of change something, making sure it gets changed in all the other downstream documents, it's just really inefficient. And so I think also really making sure that every document kind of meets certain standards and is written in a certain way, duplicating information all over the place. I know there's different measures you can use, like reusing components or using templates and so on, but really what you need is a structured data store, ideally backed with analytics to drive this process.
So, what does this look like from the perspective of customers of Faro? So, I noticed that you recently announced a partnership with Recursion to, optimize and accelerate clinical protocol design. From the perspective of a new pharmaceutical company that's coming to the platform, what does it ask of them? And, why do they prefer the workflow that you're offering them to the workflow that they've traditionally had to do?
Yeah, I think the main thing we're asking of our customers is to essentially kind of get used to a different way of doing things. Like instead of writing a document, we ask that you use a really elegantly designed user interface, like a web-based SaaS solution, to essentially start modeling these trials. And our goal is to really shorten the amount of time it takes from when you start modeling the trial to when you can actually gain insights into the design of that trial. Like we provide metrics on patient burden, on cost and complexity and various things like that to be able to kind of give you an idea like how is this trial going to be for the patient when they actually further downstream, it might maybe a year or 2 years before patients start getting enrolled coming into those sites. What is that experience going to be like? Is it going to be too burdensome? Are we likely to run into trouble enrolling patients because of the amount of time they have to spend outside the office, going to the hospital, or the amount of blood that's being drawn? So we try to get you that information as quickly as possible so that you can essentially design, so that sponsors can design a trial that is amenable to patients friendly, and also sites as well. This is really important to ensure the trial is going to be successful and completes on time and is efficient and so on.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit? So, how do you quantify the patient burden or the complexity from the site perspective? And then, how do people who are using Faro leverage that information to improve the design?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, we've built up a really comprehensive, what we call a biomedical concept library. So, a library of all the different activities that can occur during the course of a trial, thousands and thousands of these activities that are kind of organized into the standardized library. And this contains cost information that we've accrued from various data sources. So, we have this sort of universal library of activities. On the other hand, in addition to that, we have this tool that I just mentioned that allows you to rapidly put together a schedule of activities and a schema for that trial. And so we use the library to calculate the insights based on the SOA, the schedule of activities that you model using our system. And in doing so, we are able to kind of compare with benchmarks and kind of give you some idea of like how does this trial stack up? And is this an unreasonably burdensome trial, or is it maybe incomplete in some way? And so we give you basically guidance on how to do that.
Right. And I imagine that the success of the trial eventually is sort of based on the patient burden and the site complexity as well, because, if it's burdensome on the patients and complex for the sites, then you're probably going to have more situations where the protocol isn't being followed, more situations where, compliance with the trial protocol, just generally is not occurring. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, designing a trial that's really patient friendly and site friendly and so on, that actually is a lot of work. Like traditionally, that involves kind of trying to figure out what sites have been completed either in my own company or externally in the public domain that are being published to, say, clinicaltrials.gov. Which of these trials are kind of somewhat similar to mine that I can use as guidance? And which are the ones, and basically, how did they fare? Which ones had issues enrolling patients, which ones had amendments with the FDA. Each amendment costs millions of dollars in terms of both material cost of writing the amendment and filing it, as well as delayed time to market, because an amendment costs you like 6 months plus of time. And so basically designing a really, really patient-friendly and site-friendly trial that will pass muster with the FDA and won't require amendments is a lot of work, requires a lot of research. So we are basically in the process of incorporating AI to help automate that. And so not only do you have a really elegant tool that can provide you with insights, we can also provide you with guidance and say, hey, it looks like trials similar to this historically have had amendments. You might want to rethink this. So this is really an ongoing process. It's super exciting to leverage some of the really latest advances in large language models and so on to be able to increasingly make this process of designing a complex clinical trial a lot easier and a lot less error prone.
Yeah. No, I'd love to dig into that. So, you've shared two use cases so far of how Faro is using AI. There's sort of the document generation use case, and then there's also, assisting with design and sort of like identifying warning signs about the trial that's being designed and how that might lead to amendments or, additional cost or time later on. Can you just, give us the overview of how Faro is using AI in those use cases?
Yeah, these are two pretty different areas and require different approaches. So I'll do them one by one. So the document generation, we've been thinking about this and prototyping and basically evolving this for well over a year now. And basically, naively you might think, well, these large language models like GPT are so capable. Surely we can just ask it to generate a protocol. And you can't really do that for a number of reasons. First of all, the LLMs aren't as smart as we think they are, right? Like for anyone listening to this podcast who doesn't really understand how LLMs work, the kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek mental model I'd like to encourage you to sort of think about them as super well-informed, super sophisticated autocomplete. And so what that means is that the LLM is game for anything. It will start writing things and producing text no matter what, but it's not always sort of true. And so what we found was that no matter how much prompting, no matter how much guidance we gave it, the LLM would invariably miss things or make things up. And this is really dangerous when it comes to clinical documentation, both in terms of essentially wasting time and submitting things potentially to the FDA that require a lot of amendment and feedback and so on, as well as in terms of just your own clinical process and ensuring that your clinical trials are really high quality. So we devised this dual model system where we have one model that generates that incorporates a lot of clinical expertise into the prompts that we use, and of course incorporates data both from the Faro Study Designer, the design tool that I mentioned before, as well as the sponsor's own documentation. And then we have another model that essentially checks the output, and it also embodies a lot of clinical expertise that we've essentially downloaded from the brains of our clinical expert team and put into a bunch of checklists and evaluation framework. And essentially, we score the output coming out of the generator model. And we basically use the output of that scoring function, or that checklist, to refine the query that generates the protocol section and essentially iterates and produces a second cut based on both machine and human feedback to make it better. So this is what we found is needed in order to really generate clinical quality documentation for things like the trial protocol and so on. So that's what we're doing on the document generation side. It's an ongoing process. There's some of these protocol sections, as many of you listeners will know, are extremely complex and require both a lot of quantitative information as well as like a ton of verbiage that describes the process. And so we've been systematically going through the clinical trial protocol subsection by subsection to generate those individually.
Can I ask some questions about that before you
Yeah, sure.
move on to the other application of AI? So, you've got these two models. You've got the generator model, and then you've got the critic or the evaluator model. Are you using third-party models for both of these? Are you fine-tuning third-party models, or are you utilizing open source models or fine-tuning open source models for these purposes? And, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty model agnostic right now. We built the first version of this technology using GPT just because it was most familiar, available in Azure, and so on. But there's been a plethora of alternatives coming out. I tend to favor open source. I'm super intrigued by DeepSeek. There's a lot I could say about that. But suffice to say that we are rather agnostic when it comes to the LLM we're using. And in fact, there probably will be a number of different LLMs we use that are more suited to individual operations that we need for the system. It really comes down to which models perform best and are the most sort of cost effective while maintaining the quality required for each use case. So what we are finding is that certain types of content, for instance, if it's super highly structured and requires a lot of quantitative information, there are certain models that are better at that. And then if it really requires a certain tone or a certain sort of template to be followed and so on, you can probably get by with a lesser model for that. And so it's really interesting that, for instance, OpenAI has started to bifurcate its models based on sort of cost versus performance. And I think there's going to be a lot of that kind of bifurcation as different use cases become obvious and prevalent. DeepSeek is super interesting because it's really changed the cost curve on inference. And also training as well. They've made some really incredible advances in the training of the model and are able to offer similar kind of services to the more established players at an order of magnitude or more sort of lower cost. And I think that's going to have a really disruptive effect that's going to help essentially provide these LLM services at a lower cost to everybody. So I'm really excited about that.
You mentioned that you're incorporating, the sponsor's documentation into what you're generating. Have there been any sort of privacy concerns about incorporating their documentation into the generation of the clinical documents, given that you're using OpenAI or, potentially using a third-party API?
Yeah, life sciences as you and probably many of your listeners know, is highly regulated. There's a highly there's a lot of sensitivity around internal documentation, particularly those related to new molecules, which is the sort of core IP crown jewels of a sponsor. And so every single time we engage with a sponsor, we start talking about AI, everybody asks us this question. Oh, is my data going to end up being used, and made available to other people via these models? And the answer is no. So there's no way we're ever going to pass any private information to a publicly available model. Now, the good news is that we have open source models that we can run locally if we need to in our own cloud instance. And vendors like OpenAI do provide a kind of like a guarded instance where you can deploy a model like GPT-4o onto your own Azure machine instance or cluster and are assured that none of that data ever makes it back into the general purpose OpenAI system that is available to the public. So that's actually essential. That's like a sort of sine qua non when it comes to offering AI to life sciences companies. You have to have that story in order. Moreover, I'll go further than that. I think what we're increasingly seeing is that sponsors are concerned about AI governance. Like, what is the safety protocol around this? Even if you do have this kind of very secluded, very kind of isolated instance, well, how can you be sure that the output is going to be really sort of safe and there's not going to be some kind of like guardrails that are sort of overcome and maybe script injection attacks and things like that? We're starting to see these concerns coming in as the LLMs have become more widespread, more generally used. People are starting to discover, oh, there's these kind of really bad edge cases that we need to be careful about. And so we are getting ahead of the curve there. And we have a whole AI governance initiative where we essentially be thought leaders in this. We want to publish our AI governance policy so others can essentially copy it and subscribe to the same standards that we do as far as keeping this information safe.
Anytime you're working with LLMs, you have to think about benchmarks and evaluation criteria so that any changes you're making to the prompts or any updates you're making to the system for generating, you're able to see where it's regressing and where it's improving on the things that you're trying to do. So I'm just curious from your perspective, how do you think about, building and maintaining the evaluations for a complex system like this that's generating, like a very complex document with, regulatory implications?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really key to have a human in the loop as well. At least during these early stages, there might come a time where we've generated so many protocols and evaluated so many protocols that in 99% of the cases, it's going to be completely foolproof because we've seen it all. But we're not in that situation yet. We just haven't tested like hundreds of thousands of protocols or generated like hundreds of thousands of protocols simply because that would take a lot of time and money. Because as you can imagine, like if we're doing a great number of LLM calls for every single subsection we're generating, and there's potentially 100 plus subsections in a document, that really adds up or multiplies up. And so definitely having a human review the output is critical. There's always going to be edge cases. There's always going to be situations where despite our checklist and despite everything, the output does require some correction that can only come from having an expert actually look at things. But our goal is to really reduce the percentage of cases where that's necessary and to provide tools that really make it easy for someone to just give some overall direction, some correction that then gets factored into the output.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in what you said at the end there about, how you incorporate the human feedback, which is in many cases qualitative, to these generated documents into the process of making your document generation process, more effective at getting it right, the first time or the first couple
Yeah.
times.
Well, that actually plays into the strengths of these LLMs, right? Because you don't have to reduce or transform your qualitative feedback into quantitative rules, which you would typically have to do if you're fine-tuning, say, a database or some sort of more traditional content management system. Instead, you can actually provide overall direction, like, hey, you're being a little bit, wordy. Reduce the number of words, right? And the LLM can take that kind of really high-level qualitative feedback and turn it into actual, like a refined result. So that's good. However, of course, the output of such tuning needs to be evaluated to make sure that nothing gets missed. Like as a result of essentially obeying the human feedback of making things shorter, you don't sort of like miss things that are important now. So we need to continue that with that sort of checklist-based evaluation.
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about how AI is used in the clinical protocol design process?
Yeah, so this is a newer area for us. Definitely, there's going to be things that we announce during the course of the rest of this year. But basically, the idea is that we have all these clinical trials out there in the world. Like if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, thousands upon thousands of trials sitting there in PDFs. And so we've developed a data pipeline and a sort of a knowledge modeling system that takes those PDFs and essentially decomposes them into chunks of text and images and tables and really uses the LLM to interpret those and to essentially vectorize the text. So we have a RAG, kind of a retrieval augmented generation system that takes all those different chunks of text and kind of creates a knowledge-based system to be able to access them. But we also look at the tables and we interpret the tables and link the information in those tables. For instance, each activity in the SOA, we extract that out of that table from the PDF and we link it to the relevant sections of the text. And so that gives us a richer view on what the structured information in that PDF is. So one way of thinking about this is it's like almost like the opposite of document generation, where instead of taking structured data and generating the document, we're taking the document and extracting the structured data. Why would we want to do that? Well, this provides us with a really rich database of trials that we can perform really advanced queries on. So we can say things like, okay, given this trial you're working on in Faro, give me 5 examples of trials out there in the world that are kind of similar to this one. Maybe it's an oncology, solid tumor trial, something like that, but that have a lower patient burden. So let's just say I'm analyzing a trial that I've built before, or that's nearing completion, and I have this feeling like, oh, I think this is going to have a high patient burden. This seems like kind of a big, bloated trial. What do I do? Because maybe you've copied and pasted it from some other trial and added a few things, and the scientist wanted a bunch of extra measurements, and you're getting this feeling like, oh, so this is probably getting a little too burdensome. Now, our insights might tell you, hey, yeah, the patient's going to be spending 8 hours a day at the site, or there's an unreasonable amount of blood being drawn here. What do I do? And so we can basically perform a query against the structured clinical trial repository that contains thousands upon thousands of trials decomposed into the structured data, and make these kind of very researchy, very sort of like high level, like just give me some clues here, like show me some trials that basically have a lower patient burden and why. Or just in general, give me some guidance. Like, I want to reduce my patient burden. What do I do? And this is going to save a lot of time and result in much better trials in the future, because we're hearing time and time again from our sponsor clients, like they have this pipeline of trials. And because of the difficulty of actually creating an optimized trial, there's a lot of potentially copy and paste or just, best practices that end up becoming bloated over the years. And we can really help cut into that by providing these very incisive insights into how to improve the metrics of this trial.
Wow. I have several questions on the back of this, but the thing that comes to mind for me first is that it strikes me that what you said up front about the data model and the schema of, how you understand a protocol document is sort of the critical middle piece between the protocols that you're creating and then the protocols that you're decomposing so that you can compare these together. Am I thinking
Yeah.
about that right?
Yeah, it's so interesting because that was the initial thesis behind Faro. Before we were even thinking about AI, much, there were just a few years, some number of years of just really, in a very detailed way, modeling trials in a very structured way. And so really kind of like all the nuances of the different activities that get performed during the course of a clinical trial and all the different chemistry panels and other things that go into that trial, the recurrent scheduling, like the nuances of the population schema, all this kind of thing, we had that already. And so when LLMs came along, it was really just a natural extension of that structured database that now we want to generate documentation as well as input like, 10,000, tens of thousands of trials into the system so it can be analyzed in a really structured way. So it puts us in a pretty strong position that we have this data model that we built up over many, many years and have built extensive, reporting and analytics on, that now we can leverage into this LLM world.
Right. So that question that you used as an example earlier of, show me examples of clinical trials that are similar to this one that required less patient burden, that sort of presupposes that you already have the trials parsed in the same way as the trial that you're entering, and in a context where you're able to calculate that, all of the activities, and as a result, the patient burden of every trial that's come into your database, so that you can order them appropriately and look at, sort of the semantic closeness, but then also sort by patient burden,
Exactly.
something like that.
Exactly, because it's one thing to kind of ask the LLM a question and get an answer, but it's another to walk through the reasoning. Like, why did you say that? So why are you recommending we look at these trials, right? And so by having all this nuanced, structured information at our fingertips or at the LLM's fingertips, it can explain, like, for every single answer it comes up with, it can say, well, I looked at this trial and, there's these procedures that, are more efficient than the ones you're using, or it doesn't have these unnecessary procedures that you have in your schedule, and so you might want to consider removing them. And so by having all of that, well, as you say, all of those details, we can really provide detailed explanation of why. So it becomes less of a black box, less of a sort of a, here's your answer that got generated by the deep learning system, and more of a actual walking through the thinking and the reasoning behind that.
What would you say have been the hardest parts of parsing the existing clinical trial documents and sort of getting it into your schema so that you're comparing apples to apples with the other trials that you're creating?
I mean, definitely, we studied our own clinical team really closely because they were doing this manually, which is wonderful. We have a team of experts who have this very, very intricate process that sometimes takes a week or more per trial, and we got to automate that. So we got to really interview them. And without question, it really is the kind of detective process of building up the mental model of looking at the SOA, looking at the footnotes, looking at all the different sections that talk about the schedule, doing this with various other parts of the trial as well, and coming up with that sort of doing all that sleuthing to figure out what is the true structure of this trial. Because what if you just look at the table, which I think, is relatively easy to do, like you use some PDF parser, you look at the table, that doesn't give you the full picture because there's all these sort of gotchas. There's all these footnotes that say, oh, and by the way, there's this other thing that you got to do every 2 days. Or, oh, by the way, at the end of the trial, you got to keep doing this for a number of weeks. And it's those gotchas that can dramatically affect the cost of the trial and the burden and so on that you wouldn't necessarily pick up on if all you looked at was that straight raw table, right? And so I think that the trickiest part for us, and this is an ongoing process, is really threading the needle between the SOA and all the footnotes and all the sections that refer to the SOA and all those kind of nuances that really affect the structure of the trial.
Yeah, I mean, and it strikes me that, a lot of the work that's being done in LLMs right now is trying to reflect the reasoning process or the chains of thought that will lead you to the correct conclusion when you ask a question, or you try to get, particular structured data out of an unstructured document. But the thought processes that you're describing are thought processes that have not been written down and published in any meaningful way, and so
Yeah,
you have sort of this unique window into what the steps are. Am I thinking about that right?
yeah, exactly. Definitely chain of thought reasoning, all this kind of thing informs our approach. And our approach is very domain specific. So it's kind of like clinical chain of thought, chain of reasoning, right? And this is kind of new stuff. And so we might even publish on this. We'll see. It really is super interesting, going through this process of really kind of breaking down what our clinicians have been doing and automating using LLMs. It's a new thing, and it feels really exciting and cool to be working on something that's kind of at the state of the art in this area.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you've got announcements coming in the future and you're, on this in the middle of this process of using AI to help support clinical trial design. Can you talk a little bit about what are the capabilities that you're most excited about or that you think people will be surprised by once, the problem is finally solved at some point in the future?
Well, I'm definitely excited about the document generation just because it's been such a slog, to really get all these sections done. Like, I feel very proud that we're generating output that our clinicians are saying, wow, this is really good. This would definitely pass muster with the FDA. This is very high quality clinical output. It took a while to get there, so I'm excited about that. But I think that the really, really groundbreaking, like the thing that's going to shift this whole industry is going to be really intelligently designing these clinical trials, like with the benefit of the knowledge of all of the recent trials that normally would take a lot of time to read through and understand and use to inform the new trials that are under development, just being able to do that automatically using LLMs and have this kind of super informed and intelligent research assistant to tell you like, hey, I'm going to help you design the best possible trial so that you can get this drug to market faster and cheaper and with a better experience for your patients. So you can, improve your chances of enrolling them and enrolling sites and so on. That's really exciting to me because I think that will benefit patients, it'll benefit sponsors, and also benefit the sites. And that's what really brought me into this job in the first place was that premise that we could do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked a lot about the platform and about the features that are available that are about to be available, but I'm interested in, who are the people in biotech and pharma that are actually interacting directly with the system? Like, what are the personas of the users that are getting into Faro and designing the clinical trials and getting the documents back out?
There's definitely the clinical scientists, so the people who are basically tasked with designing the trial, putting it together. So we have a molecule, we have a thesis that can be used to treat a certain condition. Let's put this together. What are the objectives and endpoints? What is the sort of schema design? What are the different activities we need, to put into this? And these are really the main initial uses of the system. I do think that over time we'll get more clinical operations people who do more of the downstream execution of the trial using the system as well to interface with sites and to kind of start to think about population enrollment and all these other sort of downstream challenges as well, because our system is so well placed to be able to provide insights into those areas. And so those are two. We also think that possibly in the future, like people in charge of the budgeting, might use our system as well, because we have a really comprehensive view on what's required to actually support this trial and to make it happen, and all the costs and logistics and so on. So I think there's a number of different user personas that we can consider, starting with the clinical scientist. These are usually the first people that touch our system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, in terms of developing new features, whether they be AI features or, just classic software features for the platform, I'm just curious, how do you think about prioritizing the use cases that you're going to try to meet with the tools that are available to you, given that there are so many opportunities?
I mean, it's challenging because there are so many opportunities, there's so many ideas we have for essentially making our system more capable and delivering value. And there's other features that are not AI driven as well that are important, like evolving, more enterprise type features to provide fine grained access control and other kind of things. And so we had this whole roadmap, and containing features of many, many different kinds. And so we had this sort of ROI based process where we have some estimate as far as the impact, the relative value of each feature, and then again some estimate of the cost. And we just kind of figure out like what are the highest impact features we can be working on. But it's important for software engineering organizations to have this view of like what is the stack ranked list of features that are in order of value to the company and to our customers that we need to work on. And that's the way we've been doing it. And there's always changes. There's always things that come up where we realize, oh wow, there's this other opportunity. Or if we now prioritize this other feature that maybe is new or is further down the list, we can actually move the needle on building this business and being successful and making our customers successful.
Right. So, you're doing the impact versus effort matrix, but there's always the element of uncertainty in there. And so, as the organization grows and learns about, what the impact actually is or what the effort actually is, then, it's kind of constantly evolving. So, obviously, getting software tools into and AI tools into life sciences is a challenging sales cycle. I'm imagining there's a teaching effort that's required in order to get people to wrap their arms around the way things could be. So I'm just curious, how have clinical trial teams sort of met, what Faro's offering? And, have you received any pushback from them on, adopting the tools that you're bringing to bear?
I mean, I would say that the end users themselves are by and large pretty excited. It's like, wow, why would I not want insights really fast on my trial designs? Why would I not want a really organized way for me to model my trials and gain insights into how to make them better? I think it's more just enterprise sales is complex, and there's many different parties, many different stakeholders that need to be a part of that whole process. And so we're finding that with the smaller companies, sometimes they can move really fast because they see the need, they really want it, and it's just easier because they're small and have less process. But with the larger companies, there's oftentimes quite a lengthy procurement process, budgeting, all this kind of thing that needs to happen. And so we're learning, as time goes on about ways to really move more swiftly through that process. And of course, a lot of it's relationships and things like that. Enterprise sales is different from the mid-market for sure.
For sure. And what about the regulatory agencies? How are they sort of meeting the type of opportunities that you're bringing to bear?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's been a big change there recently, but I will say, back at DFARM in September, the FDA was actually at the conference speaking, and they, at least on the face of it, they seemed very open to AI and to new technologies. I do think they had this kind of goal of being able to actually accept digitized trials for submission, the same way that they do in Europe, and so that would be great. We're more than ready for that. That is what, in many ways, the shift that Faro is really was founded to kind of make, is to move from unstructured to really structured representations of trials to make the whole process more efficient. And so I think the FDA kind of wants to do this, or at least as of September they did. But we'll just have to see how that plays out. In the meantime, document generation remains really important. And so we have this kind of dual structured and unstructured system. But I think that everybody wants this to go faster. Everybody wants this to go in a more efficient way. I think everyone's interests are aligned in this, including the patients, certainly the sponsor and the FDA as well. So in principle, at a high level, I think we're all aligned on wanting to do this more efficiently and faster. It's just that the devil's in the details. And of course, safety is a primary concern as well. And so there's these counterbalancing factors influencing the evolution of this process.
For sure. Fast forwarding 5 years, 10 years, when, so much of the clinical trial design and, submission process is automated and there's optimization of the clinical trial design happening prior to submission that's, saving on cost. What do you think the biotech landscape, how's it looks like? How has it changed based on what Faro's doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we imagine a world where the process of getting a drug to market is way more systematized and way more sort of optimized around producing these clinical trials really better. To me, the dream is that we lower the bar for developing new drugs in the sense that, there's all these companies out there that are innovating in various ways, discovering all these incredible ways to create new medicines. But I think in many cases they end up on the shelf because just the prospect of going through a $2 billion process to get to market is just not worth it. And so what I hope is going to happen is that a lot more of these really innovative medicines actually get at least tried. Like, who knows which of them are going to end up being effective and safe and so on. But at least hopefully there's a higher volume coming through where we, on the margin, that every year there's just more and more innovative medicines hitting the market, helping patients, helping to save lives, relieve suffering. This is ultimately what we want to see happen. And so hopefully there's a dramatic increase in terms of the range and the sort of innovation that comes through with new medications.
No, I think it's a beautiful vision, and I hope that I hope that it comes to pass. I think you're right that it's in everyone's interest that more things are tried, and at lower cost to the system as a whole. You've come into the organization, an organization that was already sort of building like the structure for understanding clinical trial design with this mandate to bring AI to bear. Obviously, there's a lot of competition for talent in AI right now. So can you share some advice on how you think about building strong AI teams, especially at the intersection of biotech and software?
I mean, this is the key. This is the key, is attracting talent. It is a bit of a hires market out there simply because there's been a lot of layoffs in the technology space and it's been kind of like a tough couple of years. But that said, the top talent that really knows how to wield LLMs and launch AI-based features are in demand. And so my view on this is that you need to have the mission. You need to have some purpose, right? That can distinguish you. And I think that life sciences has that in general, like the purpose of this industry on the face of it is to improve human lives and so on. Like, great people want to work with great people. And so, the interview process is critical for that. You're not just evaluating someone, you're also convincing them that this is a place they'd want to work.
Yeah. I know that Faro's was already a software as a service company when you got there, but were there any like cultural barriers that you needed to overcome in order to reach the full adoption of AI for the platform, across the organization?
I mean, I think data science is a little different from classical software engineering. Like, it is much more experimental. Like, it's called science for a reason, right? You're basically running experiments as fast as you can to try to figure out what's actually going to stick and what's going to work. And so, yeah, there's always a bit of a cultural shift when it comes to this that might run counter to, like, oh, if we're used to doing things in a certain way with tons and tons of, user testing and really rigorous productionization and so on, that's all needed once you know that what you're doing is going to work. But until you reach that point where you have a system that actually works, it's just move as fast as you can and like try a bunch of things and just see what works. And so it's introducing that, which I think is a great capacity for any technical organization to have, and just shifting some of the thinking towards, hey, this is not a deterministic process. We need to kind of explore the solution space and figure out what's going to work. And then we go into the productization and rigorous testing and all that. So introducing that has been like really super fun to be able to kind of build that capacity within the organization.
Well, as we head toward the end of our conversation, are there any upcoming milestones or features that you're looking forward to releasing this year?
For sure. I mean, the document generation is super exciting. We're already working with customers on, doing this. And so we're really looking forward to launching that. And I think that, as I said before, I'm super excited about AI-assisted protocol design and all the benefits that could come from that. And certainly there'll be some announcements and demos. We have DFRAM coming up in the fall, and for sure we'll be talking about a lot of the stuff then. And there'll be interim, social media posts and other sort of things to announce our various advances in these areas until then.
Well, for listeners interested to learn more about Faro Health, where would you suggest they start if they want to learn more?
You can go to our website, farohealth.com. There's tons
Awesome.
of information there.
And for people who want to connect with you online?
Well, you can go to my LinkedIn, look up my name, which I guess is going to be listed on this podcast. Maybe we can put the link to my LinkedIn in there as well. That's probably the best way.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast today. Really appreciate the time and look forward to connecting down the line.
Thank you so much, Ross. I really enjoyed this. This has been a lot of fun.
And that's it for this episode of Data in Biotech. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review in your podcast platform of choice. See you next time.